Okay, I'm going to call the meeting back to order.
Senator Rothfuss wants to talk for a few minutes about accountability, the subject we just finished up on, and then we're going to get right to the next agenda item. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to kind of refresh the committee's recollection of 19 LSO 005 Working Draft 5, which was the teacher accountability. Wait, is that the right one? Nope, I'm on, or am I on the other one? Yep, it's that one. And what this bill was and where it came from, and why we might want to make sure that we keep it around and give it some further consideration. A couple of years ago, we put this together, and the discussion we had 2 years ago was about the idea of what level the responsibility for teacher accountability would be at. So when we first drafted the Wyoming Accountability and Education Act, we included details about teacher accountability that's being reported back to the State Department of Education, as everyone recalls. Over the years since then, we continued to delay the starting date for that because it was difficult, and our technical advisory committee told us that it was going to be difficult to develop a statewide program, recognizing that districts were going to do things differently. So we delayed the starting date a few times while they looked at ways that we might be able to incorporate this into the statewide program. But 2 years ago, based on the recommendations from the technical advisory group, we determined that it would be more advantageous if we left the teacher accountability component of the Wyoming Accountability and Education Act at the local level. Local control for teacher accountability pursuant to the rules that we already have developed, and consistent with the administrator, the leader accountability act, where the leaders for the buildings would be held accountable. They already are. The buildings are held accountable, but the leader then would be responsible through their accountability for administering an effective teacher accountability system. So it's not that this does away in any way with the teacher accountability program. It was a conscious decision that we made 2 years ago to say we're not going to do it at the state level anymore. That's a level of micromanagement that it's actually counterproductive. And that was the recommendations of the Technical Advisory Committee. It'll be better and more effective if we recognize that we're holding the leaders responsible and they're responsible for carrying out the rules of the chapter 29 or chapter 31? 29. Chapter 29 rules as they see fit. So this legislation that we have then goes through and removes the obligation in the timeline for the districts to have a specific, for the state to have a specific teacher accountability model in place, and then gives a July 1, 2020 timeline for the districts to be fully implementing their teacher accountability model at the district level that is then consistent with our statewide accountability model. We passed this unanimously out of both the House and Senate Education Committee in basically its current form. It passed the House by a wide margin a couple of years ago, came over to the Senate, and then we ended up tacking on an amendment that was very counter to the purpose of the bill. That's what caused the consternation, and the bill ended up dying in conference committee because there was no way the House was willing to accept the changes that we put forward. So I just wanted everyone to remember why this bill is here, that it is the recommendation of our Technical Advisory Committee, continues to be that. There's nothing nefarious about it. It really just says, rather than having the state administer the teacher accountability, the districts will administer it and then flow that back into the leader accountability model. So that background hopefully clears up some of the concerns that I was hearing before the break, and I hope everyone shares that recollection with me.
Thank you, Senator Rothfuss. Any comments? I might add that we have deferred 4 bills, I think, to November. If you have amendments on these bills that we're going to take up in November, run them through the co-chairs, if you would, please, and then we'll get them to staff. Okay? Okay, with that, let's go on to our next agenda item and our last one. Early childhood education. Defer to start with to Dicky Shanor, Chief of Staff, and Megan Degenfelder. We have a lot of people here that like to talk on this one, so we'll get to it.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, committee members, Dicky Shanor and Shelley Hamill, our Chief Academic Officer up here from the Department of Ed. We submitted a memo to you on this topic as a result of, at the end of the June meeting that you had, you requested that we provide a little more information related to the topic that was embodied in Senate File 96 last session, and that was ultimately, I think, postponed indefinitely. So in order for us to bring more information back to you, we gathered the state agencies that had programs relevant to early education programming and really worked through with them what would make sense in terms of if state agency early childhood education programs were moved into one area, perhaps the WDE, which ones of those would make sense. And in working with them, we'll skip to, didn't put page numbers on my slides, I apologize, but we go 3 pages in, excuse me, page 4. It starts with WDE, and then BHD is after that. DFS and Department of Workforce Services. Okay, so this is what we've kind of identified and narrowed down for you. There's really not a whole lot of programs that have been identified by agencies for specific to early education. Department of Workforce Services has 1 employee who is considered a Head Start state collaborative office. She is federally funded with a little bit of general fund match. And that individual is in every state and charged with coordinating the efforts of the local Head Start authorities. So that was 1 state employee and program identified relevant to this topic of an early education office. The next was just money in Department of Family Services. So right now, Department of Family Services gives us at the Department of Ed about $1.5 million a year in what are called TANF preschool grant money. So it's temporary assistance for needy families grants. They currently give us about 1.5. We send that out to local districts and other early childhood entities. What DFS suggested is that we take on another $650,000 out of that pot of money for early childhood community partnership grants. And so we would just roll that into our existing TANF grant programming and just take that money. There would not be any FTEs associated with that. And then the last program in state agencies that we identified is in Department of Health. So we've got Workforce Services, DFS, and now Department of Health in addition to us. In Department of Health, they have the Behavioral Health Division, which houses 4 employees, and those 4 employees manage 2 federal programs that we commonly refer to as Part B and Part C. That is federal money that comes down to fund services. Part C is 0 to 2. And right now, that 0 to 2 money and that programming rests solely within the discretion of the Department of Health. And the Department of Ed certainly works in collaboration with Health, but that is their program. We don't have any association or affiliation with it formally in terms of funding. The Part B program, which is 3 to 5, that is where we have the dual roles, so to speak. So the Department of Education, us, we get the money from the feds, then we give it to the Department of Health, their behavioral health division, and then the behavioral health division distributes that money out to the 14 regions we have of child development centers, so the CDC's developmental preschools. And so that program is unique in the country in terms of we're the only state where it goes from us, from the state education agency to the Department of Health and to the local entities. And it results in the State Department is ultimately responsible for those Part B funds, but we work where we monitor Department of Health, and then Department of Health monitors the local entities. So that's how it's set up. And that's the extent of the state agency early childhood programming that was identified when we brought people together and talked about this notion of getting better collaboration among the different disparate early childhood education programs in state agencies. We put some budget amounts related to those programs in here so you'd have an idea. The BHD, the Behavioral Health Division, is it's an interesting grant. It's about 90% state funded, about 10% federal funded. So you can see the federal fund and general fund contributions for Part B, 23 million-ish in general fund, and 1.9 million-ish in federal funds for Part B. Part C, about 10.6 general fund, 2.3 federal fund. The TANF grant, I said, is $650,000 in federal funds. The Head Start Collaborative Office is 125 in federal funds and 25 in general funds. And, we've had a lot of questions when we've been out meeting with early childhood advocates, people that work at the developmental preschools. And one of the big questions is the why. Why has this come up? And certainly we aren't in a position to speak to anyone's intent in the legislature. So what we've identified is the management audit studies that have occurred. There's been a phase 1 and a phase 2 over the last 3 years on this very topic, focusing mostly in on the Part B and Part C programs that are in the Department of Health. And so there's been extensive reporting done on that. And just to kind of summarize the recommendations from the Management Audit Committee related to Part B and Part C, the Behavioral Health Division and the WDE should have a more formalized Part B data sharing process. The BHD should assess its data system and work with WDE on data standards. The WDE should revisit its policies on unique student IDs for Part B and Part C children. And the WDE and BHD should set minimum regional center practice standards. So that came out of about a 130-page phase 2 management audit report. Try to distill that down into the recommendations. And Senate File 96, the way we've interpreted it and understood it would be to take those agencies I mentioned, Department of Health, Department of Family Services, Department of Workforce Services, and those early childhood education programs that I mentioned, and move those into the Department of Education together to create sort of an early childhood education office, so to speak, within the Department of Ed. And I wanted to, just before we open it up to questions, I wanted to try to address some of the more common questions that we've heard at the Department of Ed as this topic has developed. And probably the most talked about, or the one that's raising the most concerns, is this notion of what happens if the Department of Health's Behavioral Health Division and those 4 employees and that money, what happens if that moves to the Department of Education? What are the implications there? There's some concern that does that automatically mean that the school districts then have to get the money and take over the CDCs, or just a lot of unknown and uncertainty around that. And what we've been able to discover is that the federal laws on this issue, and you can see it on my very last slide, I tried to baby step through each definition of federal law. So The Department of Education, under federal law, we're called an SEA, as you know. We have to give Part B, and if we had Part C, all of the grant funds not reserved for admin and other activities to LEAs in the state. That's the federal law. So an LEA is a local education agency, a local school district. But what's interesting is certainly there's the normal definition of an LEA, a local school district, which is what we all know, the 48 school districts that we have with the board of trustees at public school district. They actually have several sub-definitions for what an LEA might be as well. And an LEA can also be known as what is called an educational service agency. And federal law defines an educational service agency as several different things. One of those things is something called an intermediate educational unit, an IEU. So an IEU is defined as any public authority other than a traditional public school district that is under the supervision of the State Department of Education, established by state law for purposes of providing FAPE on a regional basis, and provides special education services to children with disabilities. So that concept of an intermediate educational unit in the federal definitions of an LEA was codified in our state statutes in 21-2701, which is referenced in your draft bill. And in 21-2701, state statute defined the Behavioral Health Division, and 21-2702 established that intermediate educational unit. So in 21-2701, it defines the division as a division or section as assigned responsibility for programs of developmental disabilities in the Department of Health. And then 21-2702, intermediate educational unit, says the division, so the Behavioral Health Division, is deemed an intermediate educational unit as defined by 20 United States Code 1401-23, Education of the Handicapped Act, as amended as of January 1, 1989. So state law has already established the Behavioral Health Division as an IEU. If it were to be moved to the Department of Education, you would have to change the definition from Department of Health to Department of Education, which your staff has put in the bill. But in terms of other implications other than that, I don't see any. We've had some pretty extensive conversations with the Office of Special Education Programs on this very topic, which is the federal authority over this. And in 2010, they sent us a letter confirming the legitimacy of our current statutory framework. They said, yes, we confirm that is an IEU. You can do what you do right now in terms of funneling that Part B and Part C money through the Department of Health. And I said, well, what about if it moved to Department of Education? And they said they won't make a prospective, confirmation of that. But if you look at the definition that I read to you of an IEU, it doesn't really change anything from what we can see in terms of the definition, whether it's in health or education. So, Mr. Chairman, that I wanted to just lay that out in terms of what the federal law is as we see it, what the programs are that we believe are relevant to this bill and to this effort. And with that, we can open it up to questions.
Question for Dicky? Comment?
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So our local community college has a preschool within it that's funded by TANF funds. So tell me, are they going to be considered an IEU, or how is that going to work, or is it going to go back to go to a district?
Mr. Chair, the TANF funds don't have to go through the IEU.
Okay.
That's a different program.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Senator Freeman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if this change happens, this administrative change, do you think that anything on the ground is going to anything significant on the ground's going to happen? Do you see school districts taking over child development centers, or any of that loss of local control?
Mr. Chair, through you, Representative Freeman, it's certainly hard to predict what, if anything, would happen. I think the theory is that some of the sort of the miscommunication or just inefficiencies that were identified in that management audit committee could perhaps be better addressed if those behavioral health employees were in the Department of Ed. In terms of how the grant processing works, we don't anticipate any changes to how that would operate. It would just go straight from the IEU within the Department of Ed out to the CDCs as it's going right now.
Follow up, Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been on this committee for a long time, and I remember we were surprised about how much money was being spent on pre-K education. And so there was an investigation or a meeting of the minds, I don't know what you would call it, but the Department of Health, Workforce Services, and the Department of Ed got together, and they said that there was efficiencies that could be made if somebody was in charge of that. And I can't remember which one of those entities said that they were going to give 2 FTEs to where that could be done. Is that part of the 4 people that you talked about previously?
Mr. Chair, through you, Representative Freeman, I'm not familiar with that discussion. What I can tell you is, in talking with health, they've identified 4 employees. It's in one budget unit. I don't recall the name of the budget unit, but it's their behavioral health division budget unit. That they, if this move were to happen, it would be those 4 that would move to the Department of Ed, out of Department of Health. And then there would be 1 in Department of Workforce Services that would move. So it would be a total of 5 FTEs from those 2 agencies.
Other questions, comments? You have anything else, Dicky?
Do you have anything?
Do you have anything? Okay.
All right, thank you.
Let's go to the next phase. We have specifically on the agenda feedback from Child Development Center in Natrona County regarding a proposal to consolidate early childhood programs within WDE and proposal to create an Office of Early Childhood Learning to serve local education agencies. We've got Susie McMurry, Mark Zaback, and Alicia Ren. Welcome. Please proceed.
Chairman Coe, Northrop, and committee members. On behalf of the Child Development Services, thank you for allowing us to present to you today. As you know, I have been a longtime community board member and supporter of the Child Development Center of Natrona County. Our nonprofit child development centers have successfully served the children of Wyoming for over 50 years. As stated in the management audit report, the data indicates that the regional center's service delivery is producing developmental progress at rates higher than the state's targets and above the national average. The 14 regions save the state millions of dollars each year in K-12 systems by successfully providing children birth through 5 with much needed therapies and preschool services. We've put much work into researching the best fit for our programs regarding staying under the Department of Health or moving into the Department of Education. We've met with legislators, looked into past legislation, researched other states' early intervention structures, studied the management audit report, and met with the Department of Education. Our findings conclude that there is no benefit as well as no cost savings to moving our programs underneath the Department of Education. Now is not the time to disrupt early childhood intervention best practices that are occurring around the state when there's clearly no structure or plan in place for a large systems change. Our programs have been built with private and public dollars. Such a move could ultimately negatively impact the services that children are receiving. Therefore, we are asking for your thoughtful consideration today to have our program structured underneath the Department of Health and not to move forward with the draft bill. Alicia passed out an infographic on the accomplishments of CDS, as well as a postcard that shares the story of Garner Lensart, which I leave with you today. Garner started the CDC program when he was just a few months old. Garner was born with part of his brain missing and needed to have physical, occupational, and speech therapies throughout his life to ensure he was on track. Because the CDC provided Garner with much-needed therapies and preschool services, Garner started kindergarten this year, performing at the 5-year-old level, successfully exiting out of his IEP and saving the state over $180,000 the first year and every year after in special education services. Garner is just one of the many success stories of the CDC and one of the many reasons why we shouldn't impede upon the great work of the CDC's accomplishments. I would like to turn this over to Mark Zaback, President and CEO of Jonah Bank and Chairman of the CDC Foundation Board of Natrona County. Mark?
Thank you, Susie. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm a banker. I'm not involved directly in early childhood development, but I've had the opportunity to serve on the foundation board of the Casper Child Development Center for the last 12 years. Back in the 80s, I also served on the board, so I've watched what it's done to our community. And I just want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the community and the CDC. And just my concern is we've got a model that's working and we don't want to lose it. And so that's what my comments are going to be based on. But as Susie said, last year we celebrated our 50th year of serving 0 to 5-year-old kids in Natrona County. And we can tell a lot of stories like Garner, but through the celebration, we started talking about how do we ensure that we're going to be around for another 50 years? We think it's a valuable asset in our community. And so through those talks, we realized our biggest challenge is funding. And when the state has tough years, our funding's cut. And we saw that happen a couple of years ago. We had to get rid of some of our programs, lay off some people. One of the programs was the snack program, which wasn't very popular to get rid of. But so anyway, through those discussions, we decided, if we had an endowment fund, maybe we could level off those ebbs and flows and also offer some other programs. And we decided that $6 million would be our goal. And we kicked off an endowment campaign a year ago. We've already raised $4 million from the community, no public funds in there. And we're confident in another year we'll have the full $6 million raised. And so we'll be in a position going forward, at least from a funding standpoint, to help out when we have those ebbs and flows and possibly do other programs. So we see this, had no idea this legislative issue was going to be coming up. We didn't even talk about it a year ago. So it's a surprise to us. Nobody saw the bill that I'm aware of as far as the organizations that are involved in early childhood development until about a month ago right now. It was the first time we saw it. So we've had no input. We feel it's important that if there is going to be a change, at the very least, we should be involved in helping structure it. We're in Wyoming. We have a chance to do things right. And I just encourage the committee, whatever decision you make, ideally, we'd like to leave it the way it is because it's worked well for 50 years. But if there's going to be a change, let's get a plan, agree on a plan, and then develop the legislation that'll make sure that plan gets implemented. So I just really would encourage you to, let's do it right if we're going to move it and not hurry. I don't think nothing's broke right now, so I don't think there's a big hurry to get it fixed. So thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Is there any questions or comments for Mr. Zaback? Okay, let's go to you.
Okay. Chairman and committee, my name is Alicia Ren. I'm the Executive Director of the Child Development Center of Natrona County. In 2017-18, CDCs served 5,412 children ages birth to 5. We successfully graduated 477 children off of their Individualized Education Plan, IEP, or Individualized Family Service Plan, IFSP, thus saving the state over $8 million in special education services in the K-12 system. We work hard to deliver our programs with minimal funding, receiving less than half per child of what the K-12 system receives to provide the services that we do. If you look at the fact sheet that I gave you, you will see that the school districts receive $18,435 for a child on an IEP. On average, the CDCs receive $8,700 per child on an IEP, about a $10,000 difference. In addition to that, we have to provide funding for busing, funding for our buildings, funding for bringing in interpreters. I have 2 little blind kiddos that I have to bring cane training in for them. Those services are above and beyond what we receive in our per child amount. As nonprofits, each year we collectively raise millions of dollars to offset the costs for the building maintenance, transportation, and providing those direct services to children. As a result of our work, statistics show that children we serve are increasing their rate of growth by over 70% by the time they exit. And as Susie said, we are beating the state and national averages on the outcomes for our children. Therefore, we submit the current structural system is effective and efficient in providing cost-effective services despite significant budget cuts. I commend the Department of Health in following the recommendations put forth in the management audit report of implementing wiser IDs and purchasing a new data system to report outcomes. As CDS, we want to continue to work with the Department of Health on improving data, expanding and implementing new program enhancements, and ultimately continuing to provide the eligible Wyoming children with focused and specialized therapies needed for kindergarten readiness. The Department of Education recently presented to CDCs regarding the proposed move from the Department of Health to the Department of Education. When asked, the presenter indicated there would be no financial benefit to CDCs for the move, and he actually didn't outline any benefit to the move. We cannot identify a cost savings or even a reason why this move should happen and happen now. The draft bill states that all matters will be determined after the move, which without a well-thought-out plan is risky for the children and families that we serve and ultimately bad business. We believe that at this time with the draft bill, any move to the Department of Education would provide no assurances that our programs would continue to operate as they currently do. We have been advised by the WDE that the move should be made and then a plan will follow. We respectfully submit that in this case, that is not acceptable. The Department of Education faces likely future budget reductions, similar to those CDCs have endured over the past several years. Although the Department of Health cuts were significant, as private nonprofits, we regional directors became better managers. It seems questionable with state government's imminent budget problems why adding early intervention programs by enrolling an additional 5,412 children would be an advantage at all. Some feel that our programs are only education-based, and that's why we should move to the Department of Education. When in reality, we serve children with severe health concerns, such as spina bifida, agenesis of the corpus callosum, bilateral radial ray syndrome, congenital kidney disease, congenital heart failure, Hertoxi syndrome, etc. It's because of the foundation that our speech, occupational, and physical therapists, which all have health degrees, lay early on that prepare children to learn in the educational setting, and our highly trained teachers in early education then carry that child forward to prepare them for kindergarten. So I want you to realize that along with the education component, there's also a health component to the services we provide. You've heard from great and respected community and state leaders today who understand and support the work of our programs. While a systems change such as this may seem to provide efficiencies at the government level, it would be, in the end, cause significant inefficiencies at the grassroots community level and may affect that public-private partnership that we've had for so many years. Without clear statutes in place, a solid structure, and a well-thought-out plan prior to passage of legislation, the move could easily undermine the success of our programs. Thank you again for your thoughtful consideration in leaving our specialized health and education-related programs with the Department of Health until a better plan is in place, and for allowing us continued work with the dedicated partners at the Behavioral Health Department and Department of Education to monitor, improve, and operate our programs successfully, as we have proven for over 50 years. Thank you.
Questions or comments? Okay, here's my plan. What we're going to do, we're going to have staff take us through the bill. And then we're going to go to public testimony. And then we're going to work the bill. We're going to vote it up or vote it down today. Or if we don't get a motion on it, we won't do anything with it. So that's the way I'm going to proceed here to work this bill. So thank you so much for your presentation, and we'll go to staff now to present the bill to us.
And this is the early childhood education legislation. On page 2, subsection A, section 1, you'll see that on July 1, 2020, the governor shall transfer early childhood education functions from the Department of Health, Department of Workforce Services, Department of Family Services to the Department of Education. Mr. Shanor laid out earlier, that's IDEA parts C and D, the TANF grant money, the Department of Family Services, and the Department of Workforce Services early childhood education coordination program. So moving on to subsection D, this requires the Department of Education and the other agencies, DOH, DFS, and DWS, to work collaboratively to come up with recommendations to present to this committee and the governor regarding which positions, personnel, property, and equipment are transferred under the act. Now, because of the timing of the budget, no appropriations would transfer because this would all happen on July 1, 2020, the first day of a new budget. So subsection C requires the agencies to work together to develop appropriate budget recommendations for the joint appropriations consideration. Additionally, subsection D on the bottom of page 3 requires that no later than November 1, 2019, the relevant agencies will report to this committee on any statutory amendments necessary in addition to the ones in this bill, along with any rules changes or any other necessary implementing actions. And then on the bottom, or near the bottom of page 4, I guess line 13, subsection E requires the Joint Education Committee to receive input regarding the reports it receives and develop appropriate legislation in the 2020 legislation to assist in implementation of this. Subsection F, the bottom of page 4, provides that existing law isn't impacted regarding early childhood education through June 30th, 2020. Mr. Chairman, are there any questions on that section before we get into the statutory amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 2, lines 15 through 18, it says all positions. And yet when you go over on page 3, lines 5 through 8, it says the develop recommendations of the governor for which positions and equipment. So one says all and one says we're going to work with the governor to determine. They kind of contradict themselves. Well, not contradict, but it's.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's fair. It could probably be a bit clearer, I guess. I think a reasonable way to interpret it is that leading up to July 1, 2020, the recommendations are made to the governor and this committee. And then once the governor makes his or her decision about which position, personnel, property, equipment, and authority to transfer, then he or she transfers all of those positions, authority, personnel, property, equipment on that day.
Thank you.
Page 5.
Page 5, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this gets into the statutory amendments that are necessary to implement this. The first amendment to 92102 carves out authority from the Department of Health to provide that it is not the state authority for education of children with developmental disabilities or immigrant. Moving down the bottom of page 5 and on to page 6 and the top of page 7, these are conforming amendments within Title 14. The middle of page 7, we get into the duties of the state superintendent. This provides the state superintendent authority to administer all early childhood education programs overseen by the state, administer early childhood education funding and coordinate the programs, facilitate attainment of goals of the state's public education system by using the PreK Education system to help reach those goals. Provide a comprehensive network of programs, facilities to accomplish this. Establish standards for these programs, and then create a division within the department to assist in administration of these programs. And so, Mr. Chairman, on to page 9, this is where the amendment to the definition of the division, the behavioral health division within DOH is amended to be a division within the Department of Education. And so that, as Mr. Shanor expressed, would turn the division into an intermediate educational unit within the Department of Education. And then, Mr. Chairman, the remainder of the changes are really conforming amendments. Section 4 provides the effective date of the act. So Section 1 would be made effective immediately for the reporting and studying process to go on. And the remainder of the act would be effective July 1, 2020. And so generally, I think it's worth noting that the bill mandates this transfer as of a certain date in the future, right? In July 1, 2020. Perhaps the more typical practice in reorganizing government, and that's set out in statute, is a process whereby the legislature passes a piece of legislation that then directs agencies, relevant agencies, to come up with a plan to combine. And then there is required a second piece of legislation to implement that plan. That's obviously a multi-step process that requires more legislation. This would in its form accomplish the transfer in one step. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would be happy to answer any additional questions.
Any questions?
Okay, any comments or questions? Any comments, questions? Okay, thank you. Do we have anybody that wants to testify on behalf of Department of Family Services, Department of Health, or Department of Workforce Services on this particular bill? See, I don't see any. With that, we're going to go to public testimony. And if you please come forward and identify yourself and be as brief and to the point as you can. Public testimony on LSO 0008.
Thank you, Mr.
Can you
Chairman.
pull the microphone down? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. It's a privilege to be here today. I'm Sparky Turner with the Daniels Fund, and I've had the privilege of serving this great state as your program officer since the latter part of 2003. So I've been around through those years. We've had the distinct honor of providing funding towards all CDC programs across the state. And many have developed into some of the, I'm going to say, key leading child development services across the United States. We used to have a board member that always hallmarked your program in Wyoming as being a national leader. So through this process, I can only hope and pray that we don't lose this quality service that you're providing like none other in this nation. And I think that this model works. I believe that the community-based leadership is key, as well as inspires parental involvement, and that's exactly what we need in this country, is more parents taking part in their raising of their children and not put the burden on the government. So with that, I just hope and pray that you'll take that into consideration as you move forward with your vote. Thank you.
Very good to see you. I'd like to take this opportunity too to thank the Daniels Fund and you for your work on the education initiative at the University of Wyoming. That's something we're really excited about.
From cradle to career, we're involved. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Sparky.
Thank you.
Other public testimony? Any other public testimony? Seeing none? Oh, well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairs and Committee. I'm Marcia Riley. I'm the Executive Director from Region 2, which is Sheridan and Johnson counties. And I do also want to add that we believe that the move to the Department of Ed at this time is not a beneficial move. We really have not heard reasons why. I think we've been left with misunderstandings about the services that we provide, and perhaps that we are not accountable, that we do not also go through monitoring, that we do not also have audits. So we have a lot of rules and regulations that we must follow, and accountability to the state. And that partnership right now with behavioral health and the Department of Ed, they do work together on what are they both accountable for. So I highly hope that you think about this and not move us at this time. Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, there's one.
Representative Freeman.
You're not off the hot seat yet.
Oh, thanks.
And I promise to be gentle. Do you work a lot with your local school districts to make sure that there's a seamless transition from your CDC center to the traditional K-12 system?
We work with 4 school districts in Region 2, and so we follow whatever practice they best ask of us. Probably the most common is that every child who is on an IEP, still on an IEP when they're about to transition to kindergarten, is sometimes the staff will observe that child at a preschool, but other times it's through a meeting with our staff, with the school district staff, and sometimes with the parents, so that that's a smooth transition.
Follow up. Has there ever been an occasion to where that the school district's special ed department would be invited for an IEP to make sure that kind of they know that what's coming up the turnpike, so to speak?
If the child's IEP were to be due right then, and I apologize if I'm not really answering what the question is, but the children move into their kindergarten with the IEP that they have. And then it's up to the school district about under their regulations when that IEP would be rewritten. Probably gonna have to ask school district for that for sure. But we have had absolutely the directors of special education come and visit about each child that's transitioning.
Questions?
Yes.
Representative Bovee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have, from talking to other people, heard two reasons why this would be an advantage. And so I just want to hear what you have to say about that. One is it would increase the opportunity for collaboration of all the people who work in early childhood programs if they were all under one department. And then the other advantage that I've heard is that the programs would then be evaluated by educational experts. You know, in the Department of Education, they do those evaluations of districts, and that would be the same. So I'm wondering I guess I want your response to that, and what the disadvantages of being under the Department of Ed would be.
So Representative Bovee, the children who are eligible, who are found eligible for special education, early intervention, are found eligible under a assessment process that's been approved. You know, it's a national normed assessment process. So when we talk about the eligibility of children, it's closely followed under a tool, an assessment tool. So that's that eligibility. Then I think one of your questions was about all children, all preschool age children, because we, as you know, are early intervention,
Right.
special education.
Early childhood programs, if they were all under the same program, would that give them more opportunity for collaboration instead of best practices?
So as early childhood, in early intervention special education, we do collaborate together as the 14 regions. Now, as far as community preschools, we do serve children in other community preschools. For example, our local preschool, the Children's Center, or whatever we would call it. We go serve children in there. So we do provide special education to them.
Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman and Representative Bovee, I think is what your question is at the state level, you know, if we were like DFS, the Head Start Collaboration Office and us, if there would be better collaboration. And I feel that we collaborate already. We collaborate with DFS. Department of Health works with Department of Education on outcomes. And so potentially there could be more collaboration, but I think we collaborate really well as is currently. And then I did want to touch on Representative Freeman's comment as well. My program here, we serve about 500 children a year. This year we exited 140 children on an individualized education plan. We had meetings with our school district and the special education director. They came in, they followed our children on an IEP. They sat in our classroom. We met with their families to ensure there was a smooth transition. So we have that seamless partnership with our school district, just so you know.
And with all the school districts, because many of us in our region serve more than one school district.
Representative Simpson.
Before we excuse these two ladies, could I ask Mr. Shanor to come up to the table? I've got to direct a question for him.
Representative Simpson sounds like a name.
It is, but unfortunately I'm not. I'd love to be related to those folks, however. Mr. Shanor, these two executive directors have expressed a concern, basically, if it's not broken, why try to fix it? And they would be uncomfortable being transferred under your leadership, your department. Can you share with us how that you're envisioning that would process transitioning, help them alleviate the concerns that you would be a good department to work underneath them?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, through you to Representative Simpson. Again, I think I'm speculating on what the impetus for this bill was. Okay, it wasn't a Superintendent Belo's bill, but the legislature has studied this for 3 years very extensively and identified what it believes, what the Management Audit Committee believes are structural flaws in the current framework, particularly with Part B. They don't feel that we are as cohesive and collaborative as we should be with the bifurcated process of Department of Ed and Department of Health and the CDCs. And so that, I think, is the theory behind why if you just put the BHD employees in the Department of Ed, you'd remove that structural separation and you would inherently have better collaboration, better ability to work together and align efforts. And so that's what I interpret the Management Audit Committee reports to say. That's what I've understood the purpose of this bill to be. And I think that's certainly an outcome that could come from combining these entities all together. I mean, you would hope that being in the same agency as opposed to in completely different offices and different agencies, you'd work better together and align your efforts better.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cruiser?
Nope, it's down there.
Oh, follow up, go ahead, Senator. Yep, sorry.
Mr. Shanor, they're looking for some level of information from you to say that their programs are going to continue to be successful without you, your department, meddling to the point that you've destroyed their programs. Would you address that, please?
Sure. Through you, Mr. Chair, to Representative Simpson. We already are meddling. We're in charge of that money already. As I stated, we're ultimately responsible to the federal government for the Part B funds and how that monitoring is conducted by the Department of Health. So right now, the Department of Health monitors these entities, and we monitor the Department of Health on how they're monitoring those entities. This, in a way, is, I believe, an effort to just remove that extra layer of bureaucracy and just have the Department of Ed monitoring the local entities. In terms of the funding structure, we don't anticipate any difference. The federal laws, as we read them, don't require anything to change in terms of how business is being conducted in the current framework and how it would be conducted if it was moved into the Department of Ed.
This lady has a comment.
So, Mr. Shanor, if I could ask you, so things are working pretty good right now?
Well, Mr. Chairman, not according to Management Audit. But I mean, we do our best. We, like I said, ultimately, we're trying to do what we can with the system that's been in place by state statute and federal law.
This lady has a comment.
Chairman and Representative Simpson, I just wanted to touch on something you mentioned about the distrust with the Department of Education. It's not a matter of distrust with the Department of Education. It's a matter of ensuring, there's huge risk to our programs. Initially, we were told that we would be reporting to local school districts and be losing our autonomy. And when you're told that, that for something that's ran so well for 50 years on public and private funding, you can understand why we pause and question without it being in statute, the actual structure, the plan. I haven't seen a cost analysis to this or a cost savings for that matter. And I think if I was a parent of a 5-year-old and I see that my child is getting $8,700 in services, but yet this 6-year-old under the Department of Education is getting $18,000 in special education services. Don't you think at some point in time, a parent's going to question that $10,000 difference? Mm-hmm. Now, right now, they're under the Department of Health, and so we can say, these are the contracts. But if they were both under the Department of Education, I think a parent might raise that question, that $10,000 difference between a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old. Also, there has been some concern that the school districts have already come into some of our programs in different areas looking at what equipment we have that they would acquire. That's concerning. As well as, I just think overall, the bill as it is now, it's too much of a risk for our programs without saying that Part B, Part C would move together, that we would not be placed under local school districts. Let's just have this plan in place before moving legislation. And let's look at the cost savings. let's look at a cost analysis. Let's see if we would have to increase that per child amount if we were to move. There's just so much that has not taken place that we should be doing prior to moving legislation. And again, if it's not broke in the Department of Health, why fix it? The elephant in the room is that we are a budget line for the Department of Health. We get it. We know it. I mean, everybody knows it in here. But we're hoping with a new governor and a new director of health that they would actually see, how great our programs are and want to support them and continue to work together as Department of Health and Department of Education. Thank you.
Representative
No, I was just getting it for Freeman here.
Brown first, then Representative Freeman.
No, I don't have anything to say.
Representative Freeman.
It says here, and I know because my wallet comes out every time I see CWC needs more money. What do you think would happen if to that $5 million if that went under the Department of Education? What would happen to your fundraisers?
I think that's one of our biggest concerns is that if we were to move under the Department of Education, that we would lose out on that private funding, especially if in any way we were placed under local school districts. We would no longer have that $5 million that we raise statewide from private funders to offset the costs of our programs. Not only that, but what about busing? We pay for our own busing. I got $25,000 from a donor to cover a new bus for me this year. So does that mean the Department of Education is going to cover that bus for me now? Does that mean you're going to take care of my building maintenance? All of these questions have not been accounted for. And it's easy to say, well, it's a lateral move. Well, it actually isn't. We have to take all of these items into consideration before we just decide to do this systems change.
I'd just like to briefly address Chief of Staff Shanor's comment about the Legislative Service Office report. And it is true, it did make some great suggestions, and I would applaud the Behavioral Health Division and the Department of Education to work together now to make some of those changes. One of those, we're getting common IDs for children who are being served under special education. So I would say that those were listened to, and there is that willingness to work together on those things that needed to be improved.
Okay, other questions or comments? Representative PreK.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shanor, did you say your department now is managing the money for these? And how long have you guys been doing that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, Representative PreK. As long as the federal program has been in place, it requires that the SEA, the State Education Agency, ultimately be responsible for these funds.
Okay, other questions?
Yes.
Co-chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I assume you guys are licensed, so who does your licensing? Who's the overseer of that?
The
DFS.
Okay,
Department of Family
and
Services.
so is that licensing then going to go to the department?
Dicky.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that was part of the discussions with the other state agencies on this topic, really trying to narrow the focus of exactly what we're talking about when we say early childhood education. And the determination was made that licensing would stay with DFS, and that the only thing that would come from DFS to the Department of Ed would be the extra TANF money.
Okay.
Representative Bovee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it sounds like your big concern here is being taken over by school districts. So if there were a guarantee in the bill that the school districts won't take you over, it's just moving that department into the Department of Education for collaborative purposes, that kind of thing. Would you be okay with that? Because it sounds like the big concern is that you don't want to be a part of the school districts. And I get that, and I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think they want you either. They don't want any more responsibilities.
Well, I think we've asked for some time to have a discussion about what that would really look like if the early childhood, early intervention, early childhood special education were to go to the Department of Ed. I think we've asked for some time. What would that really look like? And clearly no one has been able to say that. And I hear what you're saying, Representative Bovee. That means don't go to the districts, but what does it mean?
Okay, committee, let's go on to other public testimony. I think we have more. Thank you so much. Other public testimony. Please come forward and identify yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. My name is Jamie Stein. I'm the Executive Director for Developmental Preschool and Daycare Center, also known as Region 11, Albany County, and Region 8 Services for Carbon County. I just wanted to take the opportunity to say that one of my biggest concerns was actually spelled out by the staff today with the way that this legislation is written, that it's not that multi-step process. It's, you know, if this legislation were to pass the way it is right now, then we don't like the way the collaboration happens and we end up somewhere where early intervention programs are not where we want to be. What happens then? You know, it's already set to where it's effective no matter what because of the way this legislation is written. And so that's been one of my biggest concerns with this legislation from the start, is that it doesn't give our programs an opportunity to see that plan. It locks in the legislation, it's done. Then the plan comes up and we, you know, hopefully have had the opportunity to participate in it, but maybe have not. And where's the recourse for that? Where's the protection for these 46 privately owned facilities through the community, through the state, to help protect us from the school districts if that were to be the case? There's been some conversation about, you know, school districts don't want us, and I have to respectfully disagree to that. I received a phone call from my program coordinator in Carbon County last week saying that she got a call from the school district saying, well, we're just going to provide preschool services to the kids. We're just going to provide special education to these preschoolers. I have been trying to get a phone call into that special ed coordinator ever since, and I have not been able to get a response back. So that is a big concern to me, that is something that school districts are looking at. That is very real possibility of happening if this legislation is not done with a plan in place before that move happens. And I think, you know, that's what we've heard a lot about, is that there isn't a plan. There isn't something on paper of what this move is going to look like before this legislation happens. And that's the biggest concern for us. That $5 million of private funding that's raised across the state every year is very helpful in us continuing to serve these kids and keep the cost down for the state general budget. If we lose that $5 million, that's extra cost that the state's going to have to pick up to help serve these kiddos. And so I respectfully ask you to consider these issues and these concerns before moving forward with the legislation.
Any comments, questions? Thank you very much. Other public testimony? No, I thought this was public. I didn't know we were going to get politicians up here. Welcome, Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pat Sweeney, House District 58. I think the child development centers, Mr. Chairman, had brought up a lot of good points, good concerns. I guess if you change this at this point in time, I would ask a question on funding. Would the funding model necessarily change to that 18,000, whatever we're spending per student? Would it go to that versus the 8,000? And my understanding is part of that is, if not all, is federal funds. And would we be turning those back to the federal government? I'm not quite clear how that's all going to interact. If I could, and I don't know, Mr. Chairman, if Senator Office might have a better description. He seems to talk in a language I can my diminished brain can understand at times. So.
That's scary.
Ooh, you want me to move
that? Why not?
Well, I didn't quite mean it that way. So,
that's really funny. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative, no, the legislation wouldn't change it to the funding model. The funding model is for K through 12 education. So all of the funding would basically remain identical. The federal funds would still be used the same way. And the grants and the federal programs that are being implemented and consolidated, none of that would change. So from a funding standpoint, in theory, it would be identical.
Mr. Chairman, if I could follow up to that, in the good sender's thought process on this, what are we missing in the components that a person like me, what aren't we getting? What do you feel would be better in this, going this direction?
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the question. I mean, there were a few reasons why this legislation has come together over the last few years, and it really wasn't about CDCs specifically. This committee has looked at early childhood education for a long time, pre-K, and trying to find a way that we could raise funding for it. And one of the pushbacks in the legislature has always been, we already spend a lot of money on early childhood education, but we don't have any coordination on how that's being spent. There's no central agency. And that's a reasonable argument that's being made, that there's no central entity in the state that is overseeing early childhood education. So how can we know enough about what works and what doesn't work to really put together a program at the state level and then increase funding? So one of the first challenges then that I think this committee has faced is, well, let's tackle that. Let's try and get an organization that oversees existing programs with really no intent to change those programs, but just coordinate so that discussions can take place, so that then if we find ourselves in a positive circumstance where we have cash flow, to be able to begin to provide an influx to early childhood education, there'd be an infrastructure in place, where right now it would be, which agency do we go to? Nobody in the Department of Education deals with early childhood education. Do we go provide money to family services? Do we provide additional money to Department of Health, workforce services? Where does the money go? So the coordination was really the key, and trying to get communication at the implementation level to come up with better strategic approaches, better coordination. I do realize that they talk to each other and work together, but there's nothing programmatically bringing them together at a statewide level. The CDCs operate somewhat together, but they are independent entities. The Head Start is honestly just a pass-through from federal funds, so they don't have to work with anybody, really. It's just, here's some money, and we do have a statewide coordinator. And then TANF funds are used differently from district to district, so there's a lot of difference on what's going on there. And there's not really any ordered standards for education levels for highly qualified teachers for those TANF funds, so a lot could be done there. So the idea here, the advantage here, is as a first step towards really trying to find a way to have a better statewide early childhood education system, because in our recalibration committee and over time, we've heard that the best investment we can make in education in the state of Wyoming at this point is in early childhood education. The best return on investment. The minimum we've heard is $8 per dollar, and we've heard more than that from others. So I think we know that it's a priority, but we can't just have many different entities doing their own thing and expect to be able to have a vision for the future. So the concept for this legislation was a step down that path, but I understand that some people are reticent.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
One more thing, sorry.
One more thing.
I forgot part two of that. The other is that some of us in the legislature have been concerned for quite a while that from Director Forsland's standpoint, from the Department of Health standpoint, this is not a health priority, and that budget has been cut time and again. And when you look at the savings that are actually realized from the CDCs, for example, you realize those savings over in the education budget. So when you're thinking about do I see a cost savings? Director Forsland never sees a savings when he looks at the Department of Health budget, but the Department of Health or Department of Education would. So if CDCs are leading to solutions that lead to a decrease in the special education budget, then I get to see that if I'm the Department of Education and everything's done within the Department of Education. Director Forsland puts this on the chopping block. It's one of the first programs he puts on. You need money from Director Forsland? Let's take it out of the CDCs. And some of us have really fought hard over the years to try and make sure that those cuts are minimized, and in some cases that we managed to get some funds back to the CDCs a couple of years ago and restore funding. And I'm glad we did that, because I think we do understand the testimony that was provided today that the CDCs are playing a critical role. Who knows how long that will last?
Thank you for that. And Mr. Chairman, kind of a follow-up to that, is it felt by the committee that, you know, with the new governor coming in, that will be, who knows if he'll replace the director of Department of Health, or who the next director would be? Is it the committee's feeling that, you know, a new director would produce different results? Because you know, we constantly, my 2 years, we're talking about how do we slice and dice education, and in particular K through 12. I think we'll still look at that into the future. So is it safer to be under Department of Education or safer to be under Department of Health in a downturn like this? I'm not quite sure, but I don't know if the committee has any thoughts on moving that.
I don't think we do. I don't think any of us have an idea what a new executive branch is going to do. We have no idea any more than anybody else does. So that's a variable that I don't think we can answer.
And lastly, well, next to last, I think I would actually ask the committee to consider just setting this aside or killing it, not moving it forward at this point in time until more things are set out, just my opinion. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, I too would like to absolutely recognize the Daniels Fund for everything they do statewide for Wyoming, and also Susie and Mick's generous support, not just to Casper, but again, statewide in our university is huge. So.
Thank you, Representative Sweeney.
Thank you.
Other public comment, Mitch Brocky.
The folks that were.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, I just wanted to
go ahead and identify yourself for the record.
Mitch Brocky, Regional Director of Children's Resource Center, which is the Bighorn Basin. I just wanted the cornerstone of early intervention, I think that's getting lost in a lot of these conversations, is it's a family-centered approach. The family is a part of our programs. They work with our programs. My big concern is that as you move into education and they start dropping down standards, that the family gets lost. I feel like that the family is the cornerstone, and we do an excellent job of working with those families. And if we lose that in the state, we've lost a lot, and no money will ever recover that.
Thank you, Mitch. Any questions of Mr. Brocky? Thank you very much. Other public testimony? Other public testimony? We're getting close here.
We're getting closer. I'm Julie Nash. I'm the Special Education Director for Teton County. I'm going to put myself in the hot seat as the Special Education Director.
You pull that mic right in front of you so we can hear you better.
I just want to say that I think as you consider this bill, you also need to consider it in alignment with special education efficiencies. There's no doubt in my mind that the CDC is doing an amazing job serving students with special needs, but there's a disconnect between our two programs, and we have different philosophies, and we have different criteria, and we have different funding models. And when the two come together, and on our end, we often see an over-identification of students on IEPs and spend 2 years trying to dramatically reduce those numbers for efficiency's sake. We often see 15% or higher of incoming kindergarten students on IEPs. It has taken us 2 years to get that number down to 9% with our group that we got in 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now. There's no doubt in my mind that they do amazing work, and those children are in need of early intervention. I'm just not so sure that they're in need of IEPs, and they truly have significant disabilities that warrant an IEP coming into the education system. And therefore, like I said, we spend a lot of time backtracking and just making sure that they're appropriately identified and have the services that are appropriate for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Other public comment? Any other public comment? Any other public comment? Okay, public comments over. Committee, back on the bill. Is there a motion on the bill? Is there a motion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move the bill.
Been moved by Representative Brown. Is there a second? There's a second on the bill. Not seeing a second, the bill dies for lack of a second. The discussion for today is over. Thank you all for coming.
Did you adjourn the meeting too?
Well, we're going to after we give directives to staff.
Mr. Chairman, that clears the agenda. The next meeting of this committee is back here in Casper. I believe we're going to be at the Oil and Gas Commission.
Yeah, we are.
And that'll again be November 27th. Why not? Can I just remind members, as Chairman Coe indicated, if you have any amendments to the 4 bills that we're going to carry over, please put those through the chairman. We'll work with staff to coordinate those, and we most likely will bring a different version of those amendments on that bill.
Okay, if there's no other business, the committee is adjourned. Thank you all for coming.
Wow, you'll be